part of a larger program of research that Alex and Faye, who you're going to hear about in a minute, is involved with, along with Barbara Masser and also Jane, who will be leading the discussion later on. So, as Alex was just talking about, the rate of conviction in cases of sexual assault or rape is quite low, and some estimates put it at about 35 convictions per 1,000 incidents of sexual assault and rape. Now, part of the problem, as you've just heard about, is that not every case that's reported to police results in charges being laid, and there are a lot of reasons for that. But that's not the only stage of attrition during the process, the criminal justice process in these cases. And so what you can see here, although sexual assaults are increasing around Australia, it's one of the few crimes that are actually, the rate of offending is increasing. The number of cases that actually occur is not the number that are reported, and it's not the number that results in prosecution. And again, there are fewer trials than prosecutions, and convictions are a tiny little percentage of all possible cases. Now, the studies I'm going to talk to you about focus on what happens with jurors' perceptions at trial, and we're going to be using trial scenarios or simulations of trials to do that. Now, the reason why we do that, even though, as you can see here, this is sort of the top of the pyramid, and maybe the smallest amount of benefit can be gained, but there's some evidence that people's perceptions of whether a conviction will result affects attrition at all of these levels, including reporting. If people don't think they're going to be believed, if they don't think there's going to be a conviction, they're not going to report, because there's a lot of stress involved in reporting these sorts of incidents to police. And so we're going to focus at the top of the pyramid, with the goal of understanding why these beliefs affect people's decisions and whether they believe victims or not, with the view that it might actually influence the entire process. Now, as you've heard, rape myths are one sort of belief, a prior belief that does affect people's perceptions in these sorts of cases. When you look at rape myths, they can be looked at as targeting different aspects of the offence. So rape myths relate to things to do with the victim, things to do with the event, to some extent the gender, beliefs about gender, and also beliefs about the perpetrator. And these sort of four general classes of things are linked to broader stereotypes about people, events, and specifically about victims and gender that people have investigated systematically in research. Now, it's important to know which of these sorts of beliefs is most important in predicting people's perceptions about victims and perpetrators of sexual assault, and when those beliefs will be influential. Because if you're going to design an intervention to try and counteract those beliefs, you need to know which beliefs you should be targeting. Now, some of our prior research looking at the sorts of things that people perceive as being rape, and also whether victims' gender stereotypicality affects how they're perceived, has suggested that these beliefs are arranged in a hierarchical manner, right? And so this kind of looks complicated, but I'm going to hopefully step you through it. Obviously, I'm going to have to actually explain all of that because you can't see any of the text. But the idea here is that the top level beliefs that people rely on are those that relate to the offence itself. And so a very common finding in the research is that when the offence is committed by a stranger, right, typically if you ask people to imagine what's a typical sexual assault, they'll picture in their mind, a dark alley, some creepy guy assaulting somebody he doesn't know, okay? So most people think that's actually the typical assault, and if they're presented with a case that matches those general descriptions, it's very easy for people to perceive the perpetrator as being guilty. Now, the problem is the most common assault is actually the one that's atypical, which is the acquaintance assault, right? So this is one that happens in somebody's home, typically, often in the context of, some romantic relationship or dating relationship or a friendship relationship. So what happens here? So what sort of beliefs come into play? Well, some of our earlier studies suggest that in the context of an acquaintance rape, this atypical situation, people start to focus on the behaviour of the perpetrator and the behaviour of the victim. So, for example, whether the perpetrator uses force or whether the victim resists or not. So when those perpetrator and victim behaviours are stereotypical, so if the perpetrator uses force and the victim resists, it can be seen it's easier to potentially convict the perpetrator. Sorry, I just lost my train of thought there. However, when there's a mismatch and there is no stereotypic cues that the victim is a stereotypic victim or the perpetrator stereotypic, we look to other cues, and we've sort of classed these as more global features. For example, whether the perpetrator is abnormal or normal, and other behaviours that are not about the victim's behaviour during the event, but things that might happen after the event. For example, the delay in reporting to police the event. And when there's a match with what we expect, we're more likely to convict, and when there's a mismatch again, it's harder to convict. So the easy way to think about these things is we start with the cues that are most proximal to the offence, so the offence itself, and if we can't find any matches with our pre-existing beliefs about sexual assault, we move to more distal cues, to even looking at things like the victim's gender stereotypicality. Did they go out and leave the kids at home without a babysitter to go to a party or something like that? So things unrelated to the offence itself, but we use those those features to either blame the victim or not. So the first of the two studies that directly test this hierarchical model that I want to tell you about is a scenario study that we ran with a couple of hundred community members, and it involved a victim who was Karen walking to her car, and the perpetrator was Jim. So he was a stranger or an acquaintance from a party that Karen had been to, and Jim either used force or not when he committed the assault against Karen. So as you can see, the sort of setup that we have here is we manipulated whether it's a stranger or an acquaintance, whether there was force or not, and we looked at perceptions of victim blame and perpetrator blame. So what we were predicting, if people use these beliefs in this hierarchical structured way, is that whether it was a stranger or an acquaintance would be the first thing they would look at. If it was a stranger assault, they wouldn't then go on to look at the use of force or not. They would just basically not blame the victim. However, in an acquaintance assault situation, because that doesn't match our stereotype about the typical offence, we then look at the behaviour of the victim and the perpetrator. And so the idea here is when force is used, we don't blame the victim, but when there's no force, we'll blame the victim, okay? Because it's not a typical behaviour in a sexual assault. Now, when we looked at the amount of victim blame, we actually didn't get any support for our predictions. Okay, so I'm going to present you two studies where we don't support our predictions here, but they lead us to some interesting observations in the third study. So, as you can see here, when it's a stranger assault, you blame the victim less, right, which is what you expect. And when force is used, so when it seems like the typical behaviour of a perpetrator, you blame the victim less as well, and obviously blamed higher for the opposite of both of those two. So that was a little bit curious. We weren't expecting that. We were expecting something a little bit different. So we decided we would conduct a second study where we would test a slightly different part of the model, the next step down, the more distal cues. So again, we had another scenario study. This time, Tom grabs Hannah, and she's walking to her car. She resists, but force is used, and she's assaulted. In the course of the assault, the perpetrator takes her phone and purse. Right now, in one condition, the perpetrator calls her the next day to ask her for dinner. Now, this might seem like kind of an unusual set of circumstances, but it's actually a set of circumstances that's happened in Queensland and other jurisdictions as well. Right now, this time we invited about 644 community members to participate. So they heard that the perpetrator and the victim were either strangers or acquaintances. There was either the phone call the next day or no phone call the next day. And again, we looked at victim blame and perpetrator blame. Now the phone call should make no difference, right? Because it's unrelated to the offending. So what we predicted is for the stranger assault, if it's a hierarchical, use of beliefs, people shouldn't be affected by whether a phone call happens or not. But for the acquaintance one, because it doesn't seem like a typical assault, the phone call should matter. People should blame the victim more when the phone call happens, right? Because it'll seem like it's not an assault. Now, again, what we find is that that's not what we get with the findings. We again just get two main effects. So where again in the acquaintance assault condition, the victim's blamed more than the stranger one. Right, and when there is a phone call after the assault, the victim is blamed more again. Okay. Now people are aware that the phone call with the dinner invitation is potentially a strategic thing and not very genuine on behalf of the perpetrator, but they're still influenced by it to the extent that they blame the victim more when there has been that post-assault contact. Okay, so the conclusions so far, so no evidence for our wonderful model that we collected a whole bunch of data for and found evidence for, which is a bit of a shame because we were hoping that that was why we were doing these studies. But anyway, it's always good to be the person who disproves your own theories, I think. Okay. The results are generally consistent with the idea of narrative construction, which is the idea that people are trying to make sense of what's going on and they construct a story based on the cues that they have access to. And it seems like they're doing that concurrently, not in a step-down hierarchical manner. Now, one thing we did start to notice is that a lot of the cues we're looking at in these sort of studies and that other people have looked at are really sort of potentially components of a broad schema about consent. Right? And that's perhaps not surprising that it's influencing mock jurors and participants in these sort of studies, because that's what we're asking them to judge, was there consent or not. Now, there's some evidence in our earlier studies that central cues that we give these participants help shape the more peripheral cues. So they'll use, for example, whether they're a stranger or an acquaintance to interpret what the other cues might mean. Right? So they're generating meaning from these sort of cues. Okay, so therefore it's probably important that we try and identify those central cues if the way people are perceiving these things is to rely on those central cues to generate meaning about the overall event. So we conducted a third study where we looked at how people made inferences about the event based on a number of cues that might be present or absent. Right, so we manipulated a whole selection of cues and we measured the inferences people had. We had about 2,000 community members do this. Okay, so we had 13 different cues that we manipulated as being either present or absent, so it was a 26 group between groups design. And then we measured inferences about 32 different features of the assault. Right, so it's fairly system. We looked at pretty much every single cue that the researchers looked at generally. Now, this is the scenario. I'm not going to read it all. Actually, this is all we gave participants for the scenario. But we used this as a template to insert into it the presence or absence of all of these other cues. All right. So everybody got largely the same scenario, except there was one thing that was there, described as being there or absent. Okay. Now I'll give you an example of those. All right, so it's very similar to the scenarios we've been using before. Okay. So here's an example of the manipulations. So with that scenario, we might insert a sentence that described that the victim had consumed alcohol prior to the offence, or that the victim had not consumed alcohol. All right. Or we might insert a sentence saying the victim cooperated with police after reporting the offence, or refused to cooperate with police after reporting the offence. Or that the victim and perpetrator were acquaintances, or they were strangers. So each of these was presented individually. And then what we did is we measured people's inferences. We said, how likely is it that, for example, the perpetrator and the victim were acquaintances, or how likely is it that they were strangers? Okay, so once we've presented the cues, we then looked at inferences that they're making based on all the other cues. So we went through a range of offence-related cues, perpetrator behaviour-related cues, perpetrator traits, victim behaviour, and this function of the research is there's been an inordinate focus on victims rather than perpetrators, so there are a lot more victim-related behaviours that we needed to assess, and also victim traits. All right, so they're the things we're asking people to make inferences about. Now, when you look at the results, so what we've got up here, these are all the things that people are making inferences about: traits, behaviour, perpetrator traits, perpetrator behaviour, and the offence. And down the side there, which unfortunately is too small, they're the manipulations, right? They're the things that we varied in the scenarios. So it's kind of, there's a lot of, let me just sort of simplify what this looks like. If we just look at the ones where there's consistent effects, there's only 3 cues that seem to have a persistent effect. These things to do with the perpetrator approach, which is the location of the offence, whether it happens in somebody's apartment or house, or whether it happens outside. Verbal resistance by the victim, and use of force by the perpetrator. So when these things are mentioned as being absent or present, people make inferences about what the victim is like, what the victim's behaviour is like, perpetrator's traits, the perpetrator's behaviour, and some inferences about the offence itself. So it's like these three traits, or these three cues, are the central cues that give meaning to the rest of the offence. Okay? And so all of these other things come into play only because they're related by inference from those central cues. So how is that useful? So why is it worth knowing that the location of the assault, the perpetrator's use of violence, and the victim's physical resistance is important? Well, the reason why it's important to know that these are the central organising beliefs is because they can actually be used for intervening to reduce the influence of them, right? The detrimental influence of them. And so often, as you have heard already, most sexual assaults are not the typical form of sexual assault that happen in a dark alley, right? However, it's relatively rare that a sexual assault has no elements that are stereotypic, and so in some way. And so strategically, it might be sensible then as a prosecutor to present the most stereotypic items first, even if it's not chronologically part of the story early in the telling of the events, because what that'll do is trigger the inferences and shape the meaning of the non-stereotypic material that comes later. And we've got some preliminary research which suggests that this is exactly what that does. That if you present stereotypic cues early, so the ones that produce the most favourable victim impression, actually reduce or even get rid of the effect of the damaging counter-stereotypic information that occurs later that people would otherwise falsely rely on the muddy thinking. Okay. One of the problems, obviously, or limitations of these sorts of studies is that we're using short scenarios. This experimental methodology gives us a lot of control and allows us to disentangle all of these interrelated beliefs, but it would be good to do some research with more realistic scenarios. And so to that end, we're currently getting ready to run a final study where we have filmed a mock trial. It goes for about 35-40 minutes with a court full of actors, where we're going to vary the order of the cues that we present to community members and ask them to deliberate as the jury. Okay, so thank you.